Jessica Dixon. So I'm head of classics at Woldingham School. I'm also one of the Latin representatives for the Class Association Teaching Board. I'm also on the committee for the Association of Latin Teachers. So lots of CPD areas and things hopefully we can encourage people to get involved with if anybody's interested in getting involved with more Latin and Greek CPD. So I'm going to be, like Lottie did, I'm going to talk about the theory behind revision and review, and then I'm going to talk about practically what does that mean in the classroom. Also, I suppose coming last, all of the talks today, there's going to be bits of what Julie said and Henry said and Lottie said that I'm going to be referring to, and hopefully not being too repetitious of what they've said, but conscious that some people might not have been to all of the sessions or may not be aware of some of the theory behind it. So hopefully it won't be too repetitious, and I'll keep that to a minimum. So the kind of three key principles that I base my revision and review on are Rosenshine's principles, Willingham and Nuttall. Most people will be aware of Rosenshine, I assume, and Lottie also referred to it. He did a review of what makes teachers effective, and his first and last principles both referred to the importance of reviewing material. The first one was beginning a lesson with a short review of previous learning, really to strengthen prior knowledge and link what you're doing to that prior knowledge, making it fluent. And his 10th principle was to engage in weekly and monthly review so that knowledge can become automatic, so that we can build bigger knowledge structures of which to base our knowledge on, and so that retrieval becomes much more fluid. Willingham, this is a very famous quote, memory is the residue of thought. In his incredibly valuable book, Why Don't Students Like School? He talks about how really you've got to think about something effortlessly. There's a way to cue your memory system that this piece of information is important, then you may need it later, and so you need to store it in your memory. So if we don't think about something, we don't pay attention to it, we're not going to remember it. And if you haven't come across Nuttall's seminal study of learners in the classroom, he observed a group of students over a period of about 3 months to see how learning happened in the classroom. And one of the key pieces of information that he learned from that was that to really understand something, to learn something, we need to meet it at least 3 times and to review it, go over it before we can learn it. If you haven't read or come across any of these studies, I really recommend reading them. There's a great starting point for thinking about how learning happens. So I'm just going to start thinking about memory. It's already been touched on previously, and this image from Oliver Caviglioli was shown previously as well, and about how important is this memory process to learn something really is to bring it into our long-term memory. And we can't really say that something has been learned unless it has been secured in this long-term memory. You can't say that something's been learned at the end of the lesson. They're just kind of briefly remembering something that they've only just looked at. We really need to check that students can recall information and utilize it in novel situations over a long period of time. And the act of retrieving memory is a learning event in itself that helps learning. It builds up new connections. And it really is a memory, so Bjork calls it a memory modifier, saying that actually this process of recalling something adds to this memory and solidifies it in our memory. So how does memory work? So Bjork, in 1994, he says that human storage, he talks about human memory storage and how it differs to what you might assume with a computer storage. The importance of human memories is we really need to link them to prior knowledge, and this new information is then stormed in terms of meaning. So if as teachers we are not introducing the meaning of something to the students, if we're just giving them random facts without really explaining why they're important, how they link to what they already know, it's going to be much, much harder for them to remember it. And also this retrieved information, if you can build these links, build these connections, building up schemata between different grammar points or between formations of verbs or between pieces of vocabulary, it becomes really a vital tool in consolidating that. So links are important. And he also talks about how memory capacity can be unlimited. Once it's mapped to prior knowledge, new information can be stored indefinitely. It's not always going to be accessible. It can get lost if it's not practiced, if it's not retrieved, but it can potentially be stored there for a long, long time. Bjork was also looking into desirable difficulties and the importance of the types of activities that we choose when we are revising, when we are reviewing material. What we do in the classroom, what learners feel are the activities that they want to do, that they see as good activities, they're often not the least effective. I'll let you just read that first quote at the top there. So the things that appear difficult that we may not necessarily want to do are most often the things that optimize long-term retention and transfer. So we need to aim for these desirable difficulties when we are designing our revision material and designing our lessons. This could be varying the conditions of learning, not always doing the same things in the same way, disturbing or spacing study and practice. I'll talk about this a little bit later. Testing is incredibly important. Even if tests are errors are made, it's shown to still be more effective than just studying something again and rereading something. So testing can be incredibly useful. Reducing feedback, making it difficult by not always explaining why something was wrong, getting students to find out and to review their work themselves, to think about why something went wrong and do their own corrections. And interleaving practice, mixing up the order of topics that they study or revise, so it's not necessarily always fresh in their mind. And these difficulties do need to be desirable. If the difficulties are undesirable, if it's just going to make learning too difficult, if we make the conditions for learning too spaced out, too difficult, don't give enough models and scaffolds, as Lottie was talking about previously. So we're aiming for a good level of difficulty, but we're also aiming to try and retrieve information as smoothly and as possible. So Kate Jones, there's a book in 2019 on retrieval practice, and that was in all different sort of subject areas. And she was saying that for retrieval practice to be effective, it needs to involve everybody in the class. So not just asking individuals, students questions, but everybody is doing a task. We need to specify the knowledge that will be tested. So what is it that we're looking for? Vary the tasks. We need to make them easy to check and to correct for our own purposes, but so that we can easily fit them into lessons. Earlier, some people were talking about how we can fit everything in that we need to do in lessons, particularly if we're on reduced timetables. So it's really important that if we're doing these low stakes tasks, that we can do this quickly. It should be generative, so as much as possible, the students should be retrieving this information from their memory without prompts. This makes it much more difficult when revising grammar and vocabulary, because we will need to give them prompts. We will probably need to give them vocabulary as we go through it. It needs to be time efficient and workload efficient, as I said, to make sure that we can do this. There are some questions about how effective retrieval practice can be, particularly for learning vocabulary or isolated pieces of knowledge. But there is plenty of evidence that it can be done well, or there's different ways that we can scaffold it and support it, so that it may not be completely generative, but the students are going over this information and redoing it. And the key, I think, for retrieval practice and ways to do it is that marks aren't taken in. It's very low stakes. As Lottie was saying, the importance of mini whiteboards. My students love using the mini whiteboards to do these tasks, because it's not written down in their book. They don't need to worry about making a mistake that's going to be recorded permanently. But as a way before the lesson starts, I can check their level of understanding, how well they've remembered prior knowledge, and it just preps them for the task coming up. And the final piece of kind of just theory of what's behind all this is thinking a little bit more about space practice and interleaved practice. So space practice is little and often. So rather than just leaving it all and cramming it at the end, we're encouraging our students. We're getting them to revise and review things as they go through. Some of them definitely want to leave it to the end, but we're trying as much as possible to make sure that they do it throughout the year. And interleaving is when you look at different topics, you intersperse them. So you might, rather than doing A, B, C, D, you might do bit of A, bit of B, go back to A, do C, and you move them backwards and forwards. Can be difficult to do this with language teaching, particularly if we're following a textbook. When you're introducing new topics, it can be hard to choose your own path, because the grammar structure is already there in the textbook that we're using. But we can use this much more when we're doing revision. We can revise and review material in different orders as we go back through it. And the benefits of these methods of review have been shown in a study by Rohrer and Taylor. So students who spaced out their revision sessions got an average of 74% in the final test, whereas those who crammed got 49%, so a significant difference. They found with interleave practice, when they did the initial test immediately after revision, those who did block learning did better. However, when the final test was delayed, those who did interleave practice did improve significantly on those who did the blocked practice. This study was done with math students, but there are other studies for different subject areas as well. Unfortunately, with classics, very little research is done into classics teaching itself. There's lots of independent projects that people are doing, but large-scale academic research, sadly, is few and far between. So what does it mean in the classroom? What do we actually do when we put this into practice? So starting lessons by reviewing and recalling material. These review tasks are built into all of my lessons. They allow students to come straight in, get on with the task, either silently or on their own, or sometimes they'll do it in pairs. They know the routine. So Lottie was talking about the importance of routine and modeling that as well. It helps settle them down at the start of the lessons. It allows me to do my admin tasks like the register. And it's a good way of just introducing something that's going to be coming up in the lesson and just getting them thinking straight away. Returning to prior learning, whether thinking about last lesson, last week, last term. So Henry talked earlier about how when he does vocabulary tests, he will have at the bottom, he will have words from previous vocabulary tests that they've been asked to do. So if they have just crammed for this one test, they won't be able to necessarily well, hopefully they can still answer the questions on the prior learning, but it means that they know that they can't just cram. They've got to learn something long term, and they will be tested on that vocabulary again. It could be so looking at vocabulary, could be revising grammar points before you are going to study some of that lesson. Could be summarizing terminology, as Lottie was talking about earlier. Pieces of terminology to do with nominative, accusative, or indirect statement, or participles. To have our students actually remembered what this terminology means. Can we review that and revise that as we go through, so they're confident and they know what we're talking to? So as I said, linking these tasks to what students will be doing in the lesson, so they can rehearse the knowledge or skills that they're going to be using. So for example, if I was introducing pluperfect tense verbs, I would revise perfect tense stems and the imperfect tense of the verb to be. So they remembered what they are and they're familiar with it, and you can link that more easily to that prior learning when you introduce the new tense. For example, if I'm doing a story, Lottie was talking about this. If I know a story, well, I know we're going to be doing a story in a lesson, my revision task at the beginning, my recall task might be going through some vocabulary that I've taken from that story, so that when they come to do the story, they're more familiar with the vocab. It reduces the cognitive load, and they're more easily able to go through that promptly. I would also get my students to review their learning process, particularly if you've got time, the luxury of time, talking to the students about the progress that they're making, asking them to monitor their process as they go through. So keeping a record in the back of their books of how well they're doing on different vocabulary tests or grammar tests, on the more formal tests rather than low stake ones. getting them to monitor how well they did with a particular translation, what worked, what didn't work, getting them to really think about the learning process and how they are doing. Things like doing corrections, going back and reviewing a prior task, doing it again, doing and correcting it, doing it again better. And re-attempting translations again. So this might be, you could do it afterwards, could be, I like to do it a couple of weeks afterwards, or say half term afterwards, coming back to something that they've already done. Helps build fluency, helps build confidence, particularly if they've now come to a story that they now find much easier. They can see the process that they're making, and hopefully they can avoid past mistakes and make sure that they can see the progress that they're making. And it also is a good way of reusing resources and having more tasks to do. So varying tasks, making them low stakes. We've already talked about that. And also just good old-fashioned, well, online testers and vocabulary testers on the internet. There's lots of things that we can do now. But sometimes it's just doing good old-fashioned drill, going through and getting students to either chant out endings, write out endings. Sometimes the old-fashioned methods do work, and there's a reason why they work. And games. So there's lots of review, lots of revision that we can do, whether it's vocabulary games, grammar games, going through and translating. But if you use Subarani, there's lots of games and activities that they've provided on there as well, just to vary it up a bit so it's not always the same things. Okay, so I'm going to have to show a couple of specific examples that I use in the classroom. So I don't know, some people may not have come across this. So if there's some online tools that you can use if you don't want to just do drilling endings. My students, they've tried to use Quizlet to learn endings, and I'm not sure it quite works. So I try and get them to write things out, or if they do want to interact with something, they're doing online close exercise like this where they have to put endings into the right order. It's a slightly different. If anybody's managed to find a way that students can use Quizlet to learn endings, I don't think it particularly works. But they like to have something online. They find it quite boring sometimes if you just say they have to keep writing it out. But using some online tools as much as possible seems to engage them. Starting lessons, going back and asking them to remember what they've learned before. It could be something as simple as this. I've adapted it from Kate Jones's book. Could ask them on their own on the mini whiteboards or in pairs. What vocabulary did you use in the last lesson? What happened in the last story? Discuss with the partner, what were we studying? Can you remember 3 points about grammar point that we did? Can you come up with 3 questions about the content we've covered this term? So just getting students to think back and try and recall what they've done in prior lessons, either with vocabulary, grammar, or the stories, and linking the stories together and linking everything together. So that's a really simple way to start a lesson and get them reviewing what they've done previously. All of my lessons start with some sort of recall task, and they vary in structure and type. This is one that I would use with Key Stage 3, and I would give them the support of giving them the vocabulary in blue. If they were a particularly high attaining set, or I was really confident with their ability, I might take that away depending on what's going on. But the first part is that they are revising the vocabulary, but then I also want them to put it into practice. So actually then translating the sentences, rather than just seeing these words in isolation, can they put it into practice and use it? With GCSE, again, I might start off by asking them to write out the endings for the future tense. I might give them the scaffold of filling in some of the endings for them, or if I'm really confident that they know it, I will take that away and ask them all to write it out on their mini whiteboards. And then they put it into practice, translating verbs, identifying which tenses they are. And then ideally there'll be some sentences as well to put it further into practice. So as Lottie was saying, building up that scaffold rather than not necessarily going straight into sentences, but building up so they can identify the different endings. Same with, I might do grammar points. So with Greek, identifying parts of verbs and translating it before then looking at sentences. And so if I'm here wanting to revise, I think I was revising different tenses and whether it was active or passive before I was going to then move on to the aorist passive, which was the next part of the lesson. So just getting them thinking again about their endings, or I might get them to summarize, write down what they can tell me about a topic before they go through. With A-level, so I've been playing around with graphic organizers and seeing how I can use those in my teaching. So I will give them a graphic organizer. Here's one on the gerund to study, to try and make sure that they can understand how it's formed and to break it down. Because I think particularly if you're using Taylor, it's quite chunky. Sometimes it's not the most engaging. So breaking that down for them into a more visual format that does the links. And then in the lesson, I might give them this fill in the gap to start off with. Can they remember the difference of what is a gerund, what is a gerundive? But then key is then giving them sentences to practice that. So you kind of start it off with a grammar exercise or summary exercise, but then giving them sentences to move off afterwards and actually put it into practice in more context. This is a retrieval quiz going back last lesson, last week, last 2 weeks, and then last term. It's another format I've taken from Kate Jones and adapted it for Latin. So it's a way of kind of revising different bits of grammar and vocabulary and translation that you've done recently. And the students really like the challenge of it, getting to compete with each other. It does take slightly longer to prepare, but if you're doing one for each kind of chapters as you're going through, then at least you can reuse them year on year if you're following the same scheme of work. Generally, the same work you'll be doing in lessons as you go through. This is another one from Kate Jones, which I quite like using at the end of year 11 when I'm revising different constructions with them. The idea is that you give them a grid with these grammar points on, and they'll stick it in the back of their book or they'll have it online. And each lesson, they have to take one, explain it, they have to summarize it. They see this in advance, they see what all of them are going to be. So they'll start off picking the ones that they find really easy. And then as they go along, they might get to the end and they're like, oh, I really don't know the ablative absolute, but they know it's coming up and they're going to have to do it in the lesson. So they're given the opportunity then, if they want to check their notes again, they want to speak to a friend, but in that lesson, when they are asked to summarize it, they then have to recall that information and bring it forward. So that's something just to try and revise different constructions, and getting them to spot the differences between constructions is also really important, which I think is coming up, not next, I'll talk about that soon. How am I doing for time? Okay, right, so multiple choice questions can be really useful, particularly if we've got some of these on the GCSE exam papers. But getting students to explain why they've chosen the answer, to really get down to the grammar and think about how they've come to that translation. That's a really nice review task to do at the start. That's quite straightforward. So they pick which answer, but they also then have to explain why that answer is correct and why the other ones aren't correct. Right, okay, so here was the constructions revision. So my year 11s particularly get confused about spotting different constructions, and they can kind of put sentences together and they can translate, but sometimes they'll see it and think it automatically has to be a purpose clause without really thinking about, okay, have you checked what else the other words are in the sentence? So stage practice. So might first of all do some focused sentences as revision. So going through and reminding them what the different constructions are, doing individual, so a couple of sentences on purpose clauses, a couple of sentences of result clauses, but then mixing the sentences up. And again, using this graphic organizer of kind of breaking down the different constructions and how they vary, how they differ to each other. So what you're looking out for to try and identify them. And then moving that into unseen passages. So you're building up that revision, that review, and giving them the support going forward rather than just jumping straight in maybe with a year 11 revision task, going straight into an unseen passage with lots of subjunctive sentences in. And then, as Lottie was saying earlier, you take the scaffold away when they're more confident. It will depend each year on your classes and how they're feeling about what you do. And also, rather than necessarily jumping in straight away into a test on subjunctives, you've given them a chance to review it and practice it before then giving them some testing, because sometimes, particularly if they've not met a topic for a couple of months, or if you'll come back immediately after a holiday, it can actually, be quite daunting if you suddenly then launch into doing retrieval or reviewing or testing a piece of knowledge because they've forgotten it over time. So giving them a chance to review something and remind themselves before, and then later lessons you review it and you test it again, just to give them a little bit more support. So I'm just very quickly going to talk about a couple of vocabulary points, because Henry's already talked about this before, but just bringing some of the vocabulary work together. So pre-testing before doing a translation, so testing their prior knowledge, linking to what's going to be coming up in that story. Spaced and leave practice with vocabulary, so not just coming back and doing it little and often, introducing words from prior checklists as you go through. As Henry was saying, revising and testing them on reflected words as well, looking at it in context. And as Henry was saying, so I like to use vocabulary list sentences. So if I'm revising sections of vocabulary list, not just doing it in a word list, but I've made up some weird, funky sentences for that section of the list. It can be quite forced. Some of them I try to keep them as natural as possible, but then they get a good laugh about what's going on with the sentence. But it just, if you can get them to make some sense, it just gives them some context and they can see that vocabulary in action. And it just gives them more connection to it. Retrieval with vocabulary, so trying to think maybe doing category recall, so you could give them, particularly if you've been doing thematic revision of vocabulary, and this could be good at A level, getting them to write down as many words as they can think about with people or emotions. They just pick one topic, and either to get on their own or in the group, they write down as much Latin vocabulary as they can. Obviously, if you're going from Latin to English to Latin, it can still be useful to get them to think about it, going and write down as many words as they know. My classes really like this race to points grid. So we were practicing here PPPs. So starting off with the level of difficulty for the vocabulary, and they've got so many minutes to try and get to translate as many as they can and get as many marks as they can. And doing other little testers like that. So brain dump is similar to the category recall. It's quite difficult to do with I know MFL will do brain dump vocabulary quite a lot, but we're not necessarily doing English to Latin vocabulary as much, depending whether you teach prose composition. So students get a little bit more nervous. Something to train them up with, get them used to doing it. But if they're doing it week on week, they are sharing, particularly if you're doing it with the thematic topics, they share their words with their peers. Next week you do it again, they pick a different topic, they can kind of hopefully remember some of the ones that were talked about last week, and they can build it up. Right, okay, I'm going to finish there. So before we finish, just to plug, if anybody would like to have more about any of this classics pedagogy that all four of us have been talking about today, so a book is soon to be published by John Catt called Classics in Action, that I've written along with Arlene Holmes-Henderson. Henry's contributed, Lottie's contributed. There's about 13 different classics teachers from across different what's the word that I'm looking for? Oh, I've got all the way to the end and then I've forgotten that word that I'm trying to look for. What's types of schools and oh, sorry, I've forgotten the word completely. Gone. But this could hopefully be a really valuable resource, and please look out for it. It's called Classics in Action. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, Jess. I'm really looking forward to that book coming out. So before we end this session, does anyone have any questions or comments that they'd like to raise at this point? Right. I think that might be silence, Jess. So I think hopefully you've covered off everything. That was really comprehensive and great to see so many different ideas there.